Baneful Ares was the god of rage, aggression, and violence, a deity known for his temper, tantrums, and tendency to rush headlong into battle. Nevertheless, he also represented chivalry and protection. The son of Zeus and Hera, and one of the 12 chief Olympian deities, Ares was the god of rage, terror, and violence. Known as the shield-piercing and city-sacking, he was often portrayed in the midst of battle. Though he was often portrayed as the all-encompassing god of war, Ares traditionally represented only the most brutal, impulsive, and unrestrained aspects of combat. His counterpart Athena, meanwhile, represented the strategic and tactical aspects of martial conflict. Ares, as the god of war, is also a creative entity, which by destroying old truths gives the new saplings the sunlight they need for growth. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus wrote, "War is the father of all things." As we imagine a string on the lyre, we can see that music comes from the tension of the opposites, from the war that brings harmony. Jung writes that, although the opposites flee from each other, they nevertheless strive for balance, since a state of conflict is too inimical to life to be endured indefinitely. They do this by wearing each other out, like the two dragons, or other ravenous beasts of alchemical symbolism.
Here, we shouldn't forget Athena and the old alchemist story that reminds us that we need to save our father, here meaning the logos of culture, from the belly of the beast. James Hillman, in the book Terrible Love for War, writes, "The violence of Ares Crateros is a sacred violence because authorized by its inhuman proponent and ritualized in the altered states of the battlefield, which displays the conjunction of good and bad violence within the sacred, Ares is no less divine for being cruel and brutal. Battlefield as place of sacrifice, participation in a sacrament. The whole bloody business reveals a god, therewith placing war among the authentic phenomena of religion. And that is why war is so terrible, so loved, and so hard to understand. There are few real Ares myths," writes Walter Barkett.
When it comes to etymology, the name of the god Ares came most immediately from the word are, which in the ancient Greeks means bane, ruin, and curse, or imprecation. In the longer view, the word descended from the Proto-Indo-European mres, the probable root of the Roman and Latin name Mars, meaning battle or war. In the Mycenaean Greek, it was used in the form are and was used in the adjectival form to describe gods and goddesses going into battle, like so, Zeus Areios, or Athena Areia. This word also formed the basis of the Sanskrit word irasya, meaning ill will, and it survived to the present day in English words such as irie and irate.
When it comes to mythology, here is a story of Ares and Aphrodite. As with other gods and goddesses, many tales of Ares centered on his romantic escapades, including his courtship of Aphrodite. Over time, Ares began to fall in love with Aphrodite, who was married to Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship. One day, the sun god Helios happened to observe Ares and Aphrodite making love in Hephaestus's bed. Helios rushed away to tell Hephaestus, and Aphrodite's husband soon conjured up a scheme to ensnare the two. Using his great skill, Hephaestus fashioned a net made of material so fine that it was essentially invisible and placed it in his bed. The next time Ares and Aphrodite were enjoying each other's company, Hephaestus sprang his trap, catching the two in the act. Adding insult to injury, Hephaestus invited the entire pantheon to witness what he had found. While the goddesses refused, claiming modesty, the male gods eagerly attended and laughed heartily when they saw what Hephaestus had to show them. Poseidon sympathized with the humiliated Ares, however, and pleaded with Hephaestus to release him. As it was told in the Odyssey, the mighty Hephaestus loosed his bonds, and the two, when they were freed from the bond so strong, sprang up straightway, and Ares departed to Thrace, but she, the laughter-loving Aphrodite, went to Cyprus, to Paphos, where is her domain and fragrant altar.
Going down the lines of James Hillman, he says that Ares appears in Homer's stories of the Trojan War, but there are few cult places, few temples, few description of rites or mysteries, though warring armies dedicated sacrifices to him, since the Greek states were too busily fighting one another and the Persians too. Why is there so little about Ares? It is to be expected since this god is not finely articulated. He presents himself in action rather than in telling. His legends and myths are on display in combat and the sudden seizures of blind, insane fury. We have to think of Ares as a force rather than a figure, in the myths rather than a part. The style of the gods and the gods themselves are one, said Wallace Stevens. Hillman goes further to say that the senior god of the Greek pantheon, Zeus, did not like Ares either, or so he says. "You are most hateful to me of all of the gods, forever strife is dear to you, and wars and slaughter." Scholarship sticks to the Zeusian perspective, neglecting altogether Homeric irony, for Zeus says this in the midst of one of the greatest and bloodiest chronicles of war of all time, in which slaughters abound. It is a book of Ares, its characters, warriors, its language impassioned, physical, its scenes of combat ruthlessly cruel. Yet scholarship takes Zeus as his literal word. The major classical compendium by Farnell reviews what is known of Ares only at the very end of his 5 volumes, and then with disdain. In the hierarchy of Greek religion, Ares remained a backward god of most limited function, inspiring little real devotion and no affection, associated with no morality or social institution. The civilized art of war, so intimately connected with progress in culture, is not his concern, and the courage which he inspired was not the tempered civic courage exalted by Aristotle and other Greek moralists as one of the highest virtues, but the brute battle rage, which might at times be useful, but for which the Greeks, who had left the berserker spirit long behind them, had little sympathy. The monumental representations of him that can be called religious are very few. The monumental representations of Ares in the Iliad itself, as well as the Peloponnesian Wars, the wars of Athens and Sparta and Thebes and Corinth, and Alexander's Macedonians, and against the Persians. Ares is to be found not in isolated statues, in secluded temples, but in the throng of battle, which is the origin of the word Ares.
Besides, what statue, what temple can encompass his terrifying screams and his stretched out length of 700 feet? Another way scholars deny Ares' significance is by locating his origin in uncivilized Thrace, the imaginal place where Orpheus was destroyed and Dionysus found a barbarian home, and also his dismemberment, a region away from the balanced golden mean of Athenian law and order and Arcadian simplicity. Thus, Farnell asks, was Ares a genuine Hellenic divinity? To the young men of Athens, he most certainly was, for they swore upon Ares their oath to the city. And not only young men, the warrior Amazons honored Ares as their special patron deity, and the women of Tegia held a sacrificial feast from which men were excluded in the war god's honor. We may not forget that his mother, whom Kerene says he resembled, was the great goddess Hera, queen of the heavens and wife of Zeus, though Ares was not Zeus's son. Hera brought forth Ares out of herself alone in furious revenge against Zeus for his daily escapades and prolific offspring. The war god, germinated in her fury, emerges from her wrath. As Jung wrote, it is as though we were possessed by fears, emotions, undertones outside of ourselves. All new contents are at first autonomous contents, and where there is such a content, we may be sure that in its development it will possess the individual, either with or without his consent, and it will bring a great change into his life. When it comes to our psyche, we all fall to anger, hubris, rage, and temper of the martial god. Jung thought that war and conflict is about the failure of a myth to contain personal and collective dark energies projected onto reality or the imaginal realm. The purpose of anger, symbolized by fire, is transformation, which finally brings about a certain immunity to effect and an ability to see the archetypal aspects of our existence. Otherwise, we are controlled, governed, or possessed by our desires.
Aries reflects the surging of energy towards a specific goal, even if it's outside the scope of the archetype even to know it. It is Hermes who provides the scope and goal of the aggression and savage energy of Aries. Let's conclude this video to an end by quoting Richard Darna's description of Aries in the aspect as Mars. The principle of energetic force, the impulse and capacity to assert, to act and move energetically and forcefully, to have an impact, to press forward and against, to defend and offend, to act with sharpness and order, the tendency to experience aggressiveness, anger, conflict, harm, violence, forceful physical energy, to be combative, competitive, courageous, vigorous, Aries, the god of war.